One of the biggest problems is that there's sort of an ongoing mentality of infiniteness. If there's so much and we despoil some of it or we utilize some of it in a way that's not healthy, productive, then we'll just go and get some more, right? Sort of this notion of there's always more on the shelf to get, which leads to policies that are not always healthy or thoughtful.
That was John Allen, a senior academic and research program officer at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, during his 2023 talk focused on UMSI's inaugural theme year, Water Conservation and Access. And this is Information Changes Everything, where we put the spotlight on news and research from the world of information science. You're going to hear from experts, students, researchers, and other people making a real difference. As always, we're presented by the University of Michigan School of Information, UMSI for short. Learn more about us at si.umich.edu. I'm your host, Kate Atkins. Today, user experience researcher and UMSI alumnus Michael Gates sits down with John Allen to discuss high-level water conservation problems, challenges in addressing conservation, and information and technological opportunities for solving these issues. Before we jump in, a few other people and projects that you should know about. First, UMSI Associate Professor Lorraine Buis published new work examining the impact of a mobile health intervention on Black individuals with uncontrolled hypertension. The study found that while both the mobile app and control groups saw significant improvements in blood pressure over 1 year, there were no notable differences between the two groups, pointing to the need for more research on user engagement with mobile health tools. Next, Georgina Broyles, a Master of Science in Information student focusing on library science at UMSI, spent her summer as a junior fellow at the Library of Congress. There, she explored how teenagers' lives are documented in the archives. Through her interactive blog, she shared her discoveries of teenagers at work and play in the 20th century photographs and recordings. Child labor laws aim to protect minors from working long hours in hazardous conditions. But in the wild west of the internet, there are no laws protecting children from working in their parents' home for a social media channel like TikTok or YouTube. That's why Hillary Robinson, a law professor at Northeastern University, thinks child labor laws need updating for the digital age. For more on all of these stories, check out si.umich.edu or click the link in our show notes. Now, back to John Allen and Michael Gates.
My name is Michael Gates, and I'm a user experience researcher and alumnus of the University of Michigan School of Information. Today, I'm interviewing John Allen, who is an academic and research program officer for the School of Environment and Sustainability, as well as former director for the Michigan Office for the Great Lakes. John, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Oh, it's great. Thanks. It's good to be with you.
First question, can you tell us at a high level about water conservation as it relates to your work?
First off, we think of sort of water as not really conserved in the elemental sense. Water is as it is on this side of the tap or this side of the tap, in this stream or in this groundwater. It's still the same amount of water. What we really think about is the state and condition it's in, the things that it supports or doesn't support, the energy and cost necessary to remove it from nature, the energy and effort necessary to put it back into nature in some form, clean or dirty. So it's really about the elemental movements of water from one place to another, one state to another, and not specifically about conservation per se. Same amount we have, whether you run the tap or not, still the same amount of water. It's just all the things that it takes to get it from one form to another, one place to another, and what you have to either gain or give up in that process.
That's interesting because, I grew up thinking of water as an infinite resource. So it's more appropriate to think of it as a finite thing that we're allocating.
Well, it is finite. In fact, I'll coin a term, it's finiter in some places and in some constructs or some contexts. In small headwater streams, water can be very finite for that stream reach or the things that live in that stream. In groundwater systems, it can be very finite. It can also be incredibly ubiquitous. Often the state of ubiquity, the amount that there's there, think of the Ogallala Aquifer, think of other the Great Lakes systems, has given people a false sense of infinite. We'll talk a little bit later about one of the great challenges, and the challenge is to try to take something that a lot of people think is infinite and start to understand it as a finite resource. But again, it's part of that depends on the state, condition, the location, where it is, what it does, and what purpose we put it to or not put it to.
As we try and deal with issues with conservation, what are some of the biggest recurring problems that we see?
Well, I think we just hit on one. One of the biggest problems is that there's sort of an ongoing mentality of infiniteness, right? If there's so much and we despoil some of it, or we utilize some of it in a way that's not healthy, productive, ecologically, economically, socially, whatever that is, then we'll just go and get some more, right? Sort of this notion of there's always more on the shelf to get, which leads to policies that are not always healthy or thoughtful. So that's one. And then how do you take a resource that's sort of everywhere all the time, water in some form, rain, ice, snow, lake, stream, groundwater, and start to put boundaries around it for what it can and can't do? How do you limit something that has heretofore or historically been relatively unlimited to people? And I think water is one of those pieces. The other construct that we find very challenging in water and water management is that there is no central authority for water and water management in this country and other countries. Water is largely managed very locally through a myriad of thousands, tens of thousands of local municipalities, right? How they pull water into their community, what they do with it in their community, how they send it back out to a wastewater treatment plant. Those are managed by thousands, tens of thousands of decisions. Yes, there are certain central rules on how we do that, discharge permits and other things. But think about sort of this massive amount of decision making at this incredibly localized level. Some of these utilities are tiny, coupled with a few of them that are enormous, right? So you're trying to manage a resource through the lens of maybe 2 employees in one place and 1,000 employees in another place. It's just complicated.
How are decisions made knowing that these challenges exist, and the head-to-head aspect of so many municipalities and decision makers? It's kind of surprising things get done at all.
Well, it sort of is. I mean, again, I'm not saying it's a free for all. There's a lot of guidelines. There's a lot of there's state rules. There's federal rules on concentration limits, but there's very few rules. Michigan, I'll give you an example, is the only state in the nation without a code that codifies how we look at septic systems. All the other 49 states have a septic law at the state level, sort of governing the general management of septic systems. And in Michigan, there is no such central authority. It's managed at the local level, at the county level, through a bunch of county agencies, right? Through health departments. So there's no sort of broadly organizing principle around that. So you can imagine Michigan has a lot of different nuances of how it handles things like septic. And in Michigan, over 40% of the population manages its household waste, its human waste, household waste, through a septic tank, not through a large wastewater utility system. So it is a tyranny of a lot of decisions. There are a lot of entities, organizations that try to harmonize that, to try to provide, training and talent and capacity. So there are systems in place to try to corral it a little bit, but it's still, at the end of the day, a lot of people making a lot of different decisions.
What are the challenges that you've seen in trying to deal with stakeholders that do view water as this ubiquitous, infinite resource?
Look, we come at our policy not as a matter of policy, but as a matter of science. What does science tell us about the way that water acts, reacts? So if we're thinking about what the limitations of that water system are, having a strong empirical, evidentiary, scientific basis of understanding that this groundwater system has this much recharge, it can give up this much water over this much time under these conditions. So understanding what the limits of that are really critical to setting the boundaries for attenuating somebody's use that might lead to overuse or the loss of that aquifer. So you just have to come at it sort of thoughtfully from the beginning and understand the science and the biology and the ecology before we start to think about what the limitations of the system can be. It has to be well informed. And we have found that's not just I write a paper and everybody knows that it's true. Sometimes it takes a long time with people at the table to kind of get to that point. I can give you a very quick example. Give you another groundwater example. When we were looking at groundwater withdrawal in Michigan and putting limitations on groundwater withdrawal relative to not causing ecological harm, the first groundwater council that we got together, broad range of stakeholders, from well drillers and conservationists, ecologists, business. We spent 9 months at that table, not talking about the science, but talking about the beliefs that we brought to the table. And we came up with a list of 10 or 11 things that we all decided that we agreed together before we could move into the hard stuff.
Could you elaborate more on those beliefs?
Yeah, I'll give you one example. So some people came into the table, at that table, thinking there was an immediate crisis, groundwater crisis. And if you think that, if you believe that, you sort of attack a problem as if it's a crisis. But if you show up at that very same table and you think that there's no problem, that there's enough water and it will always be provided in some fashion, you're never going to be on the same page as the person that thinks there's a crisis. But the conversation wasn't about, at that stage, it wasn't only about the science, but it was about how do those beliefs start to reconcile. So we ended up coming up, I think it was 10, 11, don't quote me on the number, 12, somewhere. So core principles that guided the next 2 years of work. So whenever you hit a sticking point, you can say, go back to the principles and say, but this is what we sort of agreed that we believed together.
I know you've run over a range of different kinds of challenges that you faced, but I'm curious if you could name any information or tech opportunities in addressing this.
A couple come to mind. Understanding the effects of how changes in water flow, conservation affect human and biological populations. It is not a theoretical or is not an abstract concept. It's evidentiary, right? What's the evidence base? One of the things that we're seeing in particular, for instance, in places like the Great Lakes and coastal systems, U.S. coastal systems, they're changing so rapidly that understanding data and data flows that we used to be able to understand and comprehend are happening so much faster now that we're looking to a lot different set of intelligence tools to help us even read the data that's there, let alone trying to figure out what data we need. So I think a lot of this new world is going to be in systems that help us parse data faster and look for relationships that we can't see as humans anymore. They're too complex. So whether it's AI, generative AI, other types of systems that really help us, because what I tell students all the time is, I can't manage the Great Lakes today. I don't want to manage them for what they were 5 years ago. What I need to understand is, how do I manage the Great Lakes or streams or aquifers or wastewater treatment systems in 3 to 5 to 10 years? So turning our attention to the tools that help us see ahead faster with more agility, and to help us understand that that's a probability problem, not a deterministic problem. Meaning, I can't predict the future, but I can understand the parameters at which the future may play out. And how do I start to align management tools, techniques, and talents probabilistically relative to what the future may be, than thinking it's going to just be like yesterday, only linearly different. These are stochastic problems with a lot of randomness thrown in. So how do I build intelligence systems, informational systems, and technology systems that help me see forward in a way to manage a system in fundamental change? It's a really unique opportunity set for people to dig their heads into.
In the decision-making that you've taken part in, what is the breakdown between decisions that are evidentiary versus the kinds where you use probabilities and make your best call?
We just completed some work, for instance. I'll just give you an example. I think the best way to do that. So, one of my roles is the U.S. chair of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board. We're the principal water quality advisors to the International Joint Commission, this U.S.-Canadian treaty organization. And we asked ourselves the same question. Everybody's sort of thinking about how to manage today and tomorrow, or we send ships out into the Great Lakes, and it takes about 3 to 5 years to process all the data. So I can tell you exactly what was happening 5 years ago. And I'm not sure that's always the best way to think about the future. What we did, though, is sat down with just a broad range of experts. It took us a couple of years, worked with RAND Corporation, worked with Limnotech and others, and asked a lot of experts and a lot of folks, how do we think the future could unfold? Not will unfold, because no one knows. But then you start to look for certain durabilities across a set of scenarios. And the more likely that something is a good idea that runs across multiple scenarios, we like to call those no regrets options, right? Those are things you can do today that help you on the path, even if you don't exactly know which path you're on. And then we look for a set of signposts, and those signposts over time tell you which path you're more likely to be on. I hear a lot this notion, and I'm going to be a little provocative here, but I hear a lot of this notion that the Great Lakes are going to be sort of this climate refuge. It's a popularist notion. It may or may not be true. I don't know. But honestly, I think it's intellectually lazy to just sort of make sort of this platitudinous statement that we're going to be this refuge. There's many things that will both support that and refute that. One of them, for instance, is the Great Lakes region welcoming to others? We will be a refuge if people feel comfortable and feel that they're welcome. Less likely if we throw up barriers and throw up walls and we're a less welcoming place, right? Where will people go and what will they do? Who will come? So you have to start to unpack this notion, this popularist notion, and put that in a forward-looking space and said, okay, now I can do stuff about A, B, C, and D, and E. It's a very interesting dimension, right? About not being a passive participant in something that may have happened to us, but now being an active participant in shaping the future in a way that we see has value. How does the Great Lakes region be the region people look to for sustainable and just society? Can we make that case to society? And is that an interesting place where people will come? And when people come here, it's not to despoil, to use, to extract, and to take us back to where we were in the 70s. But how can we use that capacity to drive society forward in a sustainable and just fashion?
Before we fully move on, I wanted to see if there were any other information or tech opportunities you wanted to name.
You know, I'd be presumptuous to think that we've invented all the water tech that we need. I'll give your audience one of the grand challenges. There's no probe, there's no chip that allows us to assess phosphorus in water. Phosphorus, to do phosphorus chemistry is still a wet chemistry problem. You can automate it with a tray, but it's still a wet chemistry problem. Reagents, right? There's no phosphorus on a chip. There's other things you can do on a chip. Who's going to invent that? There's a lot of tech beyond sort of the intellectual, the data, the management, the storage, the fuzzy logic systems, right? Sort of these informational systems. There's also just hard, who's got a better filter? Who can get PFAS out of the water better, faster? Who can attenuate phosphorus that's already in the system, whether it's a Haydite system or any other kind of a filtration that would selectively pull out phosphorus? Wouldn't that be great? Guess what? We don't know that tech. Lots of tech opportunities on the innovative side, entrepreneurial side. I participate in some as a venture capital kind of guy. So I participate in a small firm, and we're looking for tech all the time that solves societal problems.
In your career, I imagine you've seen a lot of major issues revolving around conservation. And I'm curious, if you had a magic wand that could change one aspect of these problems, what would it be?
It's been really difficult. I mean, conservation is, and I think it very broadly. I'm not just thinking about water conservation per se, but I'm thinking sort of the value of conservation at a landscape level, right? Whether it's water, land, the components of creating an environment in which people thrive. We have historically thought about many of our ills as sort of very isolated problems, and we've invented a policy or a regulation to deal with them, right? But sort of thinking holistically about a landscape and what's the healthy functional basis of a landscape ecologically. And then how do you imbue that in a society? How does society absorb that? It's a systems problem. And getting more thinking around sort of these systems nature problems, these system level problems is incredibly complicated, very hard to communicate. I will say from a conservation standpoint, the best ways that this has happened is when we tell the best stories. It's not just about the data. It's not just about the regulation or the policy. It's about the way people connect.
So is your wish to better execute storytelling in an effort to win hearts and minds and change policy and behaviors?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm there to win hearts and minds, but what I want to do is understand the nature and the context of the relationship between humans and their environment and humans and each other. You'll hear me talk about 4 values all the time. It's about 4 values. Ecological value, sort of the underpinning of healthy systems. Economic value. We're economic actors, right? We work, we play, we live, we generate capacity for our homes and our families. But it's also about social value, the ability to knit, and it's about cultural value, the ability to believe collectively. And what I'm probably as deeply concerned about is sort of the erosion of social and cultural capacities to knit. So the words that we use now are things like cohesion, identity, rootedness, affinity, these social connectors. I can work all day on the ecological connectors, habitat, sediment, flow, hydrology, but I also have to understand their correlative relationship to the knitting together of human society. In a world that feels like it's fracturing, what are we doing to curate cohesion and care? That's a challenge. And I think every one of your students and everybody should be thinking about the curation of care.
You can watch the full talk by clicking the link in our show notes. To learn more about upcoming events like this, visit us at umsi.info/events. And make sure to subscribe to Information Changes Everything wherever you listen to podcasts, so you never miss an episode. Before we go, did you know that UMSI has an exciting curriculum for augmented reality and UX applications in the automotive industry? We're helping create the next generation of leaders for the industry that's synonymous with Michigan. Find out more about our auto UX offerings by visiting our website, si.umich.edu, or click the link in our show notes. The University of Michigan School of Information creates and shares knowledge so that people like you will use information with technology to build a better world. Don't forget to subscribe to Information Changes Everything on your favorite podcast platform. And if you've got questions, comments, or episode ideas, send us an email at umsipodcast@umich.edu. From all of us at the University of Michigan School of Information, thanks for listening.